Hello, 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 hello. Hello. I'll keep saying hello until people stop. So we're going to be starting in about 5 minutes. Please grab your seats. I'll sing. I really will sing. You don't want to hear the singing. The front row is reserved. You still have a couple minutes, but we're starting in less than 5. Perfect. Hello, hello. We're slowly starting. Give it another 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Perfect. I'll be really short. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marcin Zedowitz. I'm the Trade Commissioner for Energy and Mining here at the Canadian High Commission. My important role is just to do one quick housekeeping announcement, is that we do not have any scheduled fire alarms right now. So if you do hear a fire alarm, please remain calm, and please exit to the same entrance that you came through. And then someone from the High Commission staff will help to support you. And with that, we can kick it off, and I'd like to introduce to stage the Honourable High Commissioner Goodale.
Martin, thank you, and Marcin, thank you, and all of your colleagues in the trade section for organizing another great event at Canada House. Congratulations, well done. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. Bienvenue à la Maison du Canada. For some of you, it may well be welcome back to Canada House, because we have hosted several discussions here over the past year or so about clean energy and new and greener energy sources, reducing carbon, not energy, carbon, and the evolution toward the low-carbon economy of the future. It's all about decarbonization and how industrial economies like Canada and the UK make that critical transition. The transition is, of course, necessary to meet the challenges presented by climate change, so it's a great pleasure for us to have with us today Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Jonathan Wilkinson, back to Canada House today to join another discussion about these important topics. Jonathan has been leading Canada's transition through his efforts to support decarbonization in industrial facilities and manufacturing processes, his work on carbon management, including CCUS, but also much more than that, and his commitment to building resiliency in Canada's critical mineral supply chains, to name just a few of the initiatives that he is driving. This transition, of course, is not easy. It will require careful policy support, coordination between governments and industry, and significant capital investments. And that's why events like this one are so very important. They bring together government, industry, and investors, as well as key organizations from both Canada and the United Kingdom, and they provide a forum for all of us to discuss the latest in technology and innovation, what is working and what is not, and where all of us see the opportunities and the challenges ahead. Today, we can hear from both Canada and the UK about what we are doing to decarbonize those hard-to-abate sectors such as cement manufacturing, chemical production, steel making, and petrochemical refining. This is also part of broader efforts that we're making to support collaboration between Canada and the United Kingdom on a great many fronts as we move toward that low-carbon economy. A couple of weeks ago, for example, Canada and the UK signed a renewed Memorandum of Understanding on science, technology, and innovation that strengthens bilateral cooperation, recognizes that research and innovation are fundamental to economic growth, and help to drive the commercialization of innovation into the future. Last year, we also launched our Canada-UK Critical Minerals Supply Chain Dialogue, recognizing the essential role that those minerals play on the path to net zero. Critical minerals, as you all know, are used in almost all modern and green technologies, from solar panels to electric vehicles, and the dialogue establishes a framework for both of our countries to better integrate our supply chains through joint research, innovation, facilitating investments. The UK, I am told, has identified 18 minerals that it has designated as critical, and Canada can be the world's most reliable source for at least 14 of them. Coming back to this specific discussion this afternoon, we are very pleased to have brought together expert speakers to discuss how carbon management and hydrogen are being incorporated in the drive to drive down emissions in the industrial sector. And that sector is so very important because it is a key driver of Canada's economic well-being, as well as here in the UK, contributing to exports and providing good jobs all across the country. But the sector represents close to 10% of the country's carbon emissions. The challenge is, how do you grow that vital industrial sector and yet make emissions fall at the same time? And I think Canada is showing some of the way forward in the work that we're undertaking on carbon management, CCUS, and hydrogen. Canada has had a hydrogen strategy since 2020 that aims to leverage our competitive advantage in the production and distribution of hydrogen while looking to become a global leader in hydrogen exports. And in September of last year, Minister Wilkinson launched the Canadian Carbon Management Strategy that sets out a path to decarbonize Canada's heavy industries while at the same time ensuring that they can compete and succeed in global markets. Well, with so much to discuss, I am very much looking forward to this afternoon and the contributions that all of you will make to these very important topics. And to begin the process, I am very pleased to present now Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Minister Jonathan Wilkinson.
Thank you very much, Ralph, for the kind introduction. I should say that Ralph has been kind of a fixture in my life. We both are from Saskatchewan. I actually was in elementary school when Ralph was in the provincial legislature, so he has been somebody I have followed throughout a long career, a long and very distinguished career. I am very pleased to be here to talk a little bit about some of Canada's efforts with respect to decarbonization. I think we also are going to do a few questions if folks are interested at the end. And I have a written speech, but I think maybe I'm actually just going to talk. I had the great privilege this morning of being up at Oxford talking to university students from around the world, but a lot of them were Rhodes Scholars from around the world. I was there because I had the great privilege of actually attending Oxford for a couple of years, and I thought it would be interesting to have a conversation with them, partly because I'd actually like to encourage some of them to come and work for the Government of Canada, whether they work in the public service or in the political side of government. And I have to say, the discussion that we had this morning was, from my perspective, quite inspiring. Certainly the issues around climate change and the energy transition are enormously important for people of that generation. But there was maybe not optimism, but I think an enormous commitment on the part of all of those folks that were gathered this morning to trying to understand how they can actually be part of this conversation and part of addressing what is an existential threat to their future. In that context, climate change clearly is an existential threat to the future of the human race. It is a science issue, shouldn't be a partisan issue. It is a science issue. We need to address it. We need to address it in thoughtful ways. Canada has a climate plan, a very detailed climate plan. We have actually worked very hard on that. We've worked with our friends in the United Kingdom and in the European Union very closely on that. Before I was Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, I was the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. And I had the opportunity to work with many of my colleagues to develop the first plan that Canada has ever had that actually showed how we would not only achieve the targets that we had established for ourselves, but that we would beat them. And in the aftermath of that, we raised the targets to make them more closely aligned with what the science tells us we need to do. But climate change and reducing emissions are critically important, but they're not enough. Not if we actually want to win this battle for hearts and minds and to ensure that we have continuing support to do the work that needs to be done. I often say that in Canada, and I would hazard a guess that it's not dissimilar here, there's probably 20 to 25% of the population that is so concerned about climate change that they are willing to make sacrifices in their daily lives. They are often young people. They are often church groups and social and community organizations. There's probably 10 to 15% of the folks who don't believe climate change is real or don't think it is a very important issue. But the bulk of people are in the middle. They believe climate change is real. They believe it's important. They think their government should address it. But they also want to know that they're going to have a job tomorrow. They want to know they're going to be able to afford to pay their mortgage. And they want to certainly have a view that their children are going to have a job and a standard of living that is not dissimilar to the standard of living that they have enjoyed themselves. And so my personal view is, if you're going to win the war on climate change, you have to talk to people about why they should be optimistic that the economy of the future, the low-carbon economy of the future, can be a prosperous economy. That is certainly something that I believe is true for Canada, and I think it is true for most countries around the world who approach this in a thoughtful way. They approach it in a manner that actually tries to identify the comparative advantages that they have or can reasonably develop in areas that are going to be significant in terms of a future economy that actually is a low-carbon economy. Canada is, I would think, quite advantaged in that regard. We have an abundance of raw materials, raw resources, that will be relevant in the context of a low-carbon economy. And we have a very well-educated workforce, and we actually have a very well-developed, robust immigration system that actually helps us with some of the demographic challenges that countries in the G7 and other Western countries are experiencing and are going to experience moving forward. Areas like critical minerals, not just digging them out of the ground, but there are going to be need for enormous expansion of critical minerals, but also the processing of critical minerals, which presently takes place largely in China and needs to take place in a more diversified way around the world. The manufacturing of batteries, the manufacturing of electric vehicles and other products, hydrogen, biofuels, nuclear technology, carbon capture and sequestration, and renewable energy technologies, some of which there are countries that are far ahead, like wind power with Denmark, or solar power and manufacturing in China, but certainly areas like geothermal and biomass. We obviously need to be thinking about how we actually build industries, in the same way that the government of the United Kingdom needs to think about how it will create industries that are going to benefit from the changes that are going to need to happen. Canada also needs to have a thoughtful approach as to how we manage the transition with respect to our oil and gas sector in the same way that the United Kingdom does. We have to be thoughtful about the fact that the peak for oil, gas, and coal will happen this decade, according to the International Energy Agency. And there will be a decline as we see more technologies like electric vehicles deployed in larger and larger numbers. And so how do you actually compete in a declining market? Well, you decarbonize. You actually offer the lowest carbon products in the world. You seek competitive advantage in a market that is going to be a shrinking market, and you seek to develop a niche in non-combustion related applications of oil and gas that don't contribute to climate change, but can be things that provide value in petrochemicals, in solvents, in lubricants, in building materials like carbon graphite, and for hydrogen, in low-carbon hydrogen derived from natural gas. Certainly, I think the subjects that are going to primarily be discussed today are in the areas of carbon management and hydrogen. Certainly, we are doing a lot of work on the carbon management side. We have a number of companies that are involved in carbon management in Canada. And carbon management is obviously not just carbon capture and sequestration, although that is important. It is direct air capture. It is mineralization-related technologies. It is technologies associated with utilizing the oceans as a carbon sink. So companies in Canada like Svante, Carbon Cure, Carbon Engineering, Deep Sky, and the Oceans Networks Canada are all looking at different areas in that. I know there are similarly in the United Kingdom a number of carbon capture-related technology companies, including Carbon Clean, Carbonate Systems, and CCM technologies. They are all going to be critically important to decarbonizing heavy industries like cement, like steel manufacturing, like the oil and gas sector, refining, and others. Certainly, we are looking towards large-scale deployment in Canada's oil sands area in Alberta. But certainly, we are already seeing deployment in areas like cement with the Heidelberg facility in Edmonton, the Air Products hydrogen facility in Edmonton. We just announced, or Dow just announced, a $12 billion investment in the world's first net zero petrochemical facility in Alberta. We have Husky and other oil and gas companies doing this. And I don't know if folks noticed, but I was just at the IEA in Paris, and one of the conversations that my deputy was having was with BlackRock. And BlackRock was telling them about an investment they just made in Texas, a huge investment in direct air capture from using Canadian technology, but led by Occidental Petroleum. So certainly there is going to be enormous demand for this. There are many applications and industrial applications that are very hard to decarbonize, and through which we are going to need carbon-related technologies. We also know from the IPCC that we almost certainly are heading towards an overshoot of what we need to do in terms of 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we will need direct air capture and other technologies like that, negative emissions technologies, to be able to actually ensure that we get back to a track that is a sustainable track. So working on those kinds of technologies, I would say, is important in both countries. I think we need to be thoughtful about how we learn from each other, how we utilize technologies that may be developed by each other in order to allow us to go faster and to do so in a way that is cost effective. A long time ago, I worked for a company called Bain & Company, which is one of the global management consulting companies. And I think the most powerful tool that the management consultancies often use is something very simple. It's best demonstrated practices, where you essentially benchmark what others are doing, even within the company's own different operations, to learn about how you can actually do things better and do things faster. And that is something that we should be endeavoring to do in the G7. We should be endeavoring to do more broadly than in the G7. And that is certainly something that we are interested in working on with the United Kingdom going forward. In terms of hydrogen, there's obviously, people often talk about the colors of hydrogen, green and blue and purple and turquoise and everything else. I don't really like the color sort of dichotomy. I think that gets into a political conversation. Ultimately, what really matters is the carbon intensity of the hydrogen. And if you can actually derive hydrogen from natural gas in a very low carbon intensive way, there should be no reason why you wouldn't use that hydrogen vis-a-vis renewables-based hydrogen. We have a lot of companies that are developing technologies to take natural gas and to convert it into hydrogen in an ultra low carbon way. They certainly include optimizing long-standing hydrogen production technologies like autothermal reforming and steam methane reforming. The Air Products facility I referenced is a modification of an autothermal reforming process that is modified in such a way that you can get very high levels of carbon capture. But there's also novel technologies, pyrolysis-based technologies, that actually offer promise to be able to eliminate carbon capture itself, to be able to actually drop carbon out as a solid rather than as gas. And then, of course, there are renewables-based technologies that are typically either wind or solar, most often probably wind, to electrolyze. And there's certainly a lot of work going on in optimizing technology with respect to electrolysis. We are interested in all of those. And I know the United Kingdom is interested in all of those. Again, it is useful for us to be thinking about how we learn from each other. Again, I think we both are looking for sources of investment in projects to help us to go further, faster with respect to decarbonization and with respect to building that economy of the future. So I'm not going to spend a lot more time talking, but I guess I would say, for those of you who are in the finance community, we are a country that is very much open for business in terms of trying to find pathways through which we aggregate investment in projects that are going to help us to actually move more quickly. Time is not our friend in the fight against climate change, and we are in a global competition in terms of building the economy of the future. Anybody who doubts that should read the World Economic Outlook and look at both the speed of the change, but where some of the changes are happening most quickly. So one of the facts in there that I found quite interesting is 3 years ago, 1 in 25 vehicles sold around the world was zero emission. Last year, it was 1 in 5. That happened in less than 3 years. That's an amazing change. But also where this change is happening. China is now the world's largest developer and deployer of renewable energy technology. China is now one of the either number 1 or number 2 of manufacturing electric vehicles and the number 1 deployer of electric vehicles. China now controls the bulk of critical minerals around the world and almost all of the critical minerals processing. China has made a very thoughtful and strategic bet on the energy transition. And any Western countries that actually want to ensure long-term prosperity better get going. And so we need to be working together. We need to be thinking forward about how we do this. Climate change is not going away, but those who actually are not thoughtful and strategic about where we are going to get left behind, and their economies will suffer. So I certainly welcome your interest in this subject. I welcome the conversations that are going to happen. We would certainly welcome your participation in some of the work that we are trying to do in Canada, but we're also very interested in the work that is going on here in the United Kingdom. So with that, I thank you for your attention and be happy to answer a few questions.
The Q&A kind of was sprung up on us, but awesome that the minister has agreed. Spontaneity is what is it? I don't even know what the expression is. But yeah, it's open to Q&A, so we have about 5 to 7 minutes. So if there's any questions, I'm not sure if we have a mic running up. Yeah, we do actually have a mic. So if you have a loud voice, tell me, but there's first questions right there. So we'll check it out if, go ahead. See if it works or. Okay, perfect then.
Hi, I'm Tanya. I'm here representing the Scottish Hydrogen Innovation Network. And because I'm representing innovation, I have to ask, what do you think the greatest challenges to innovators in Canada working in carbon capture and hydrogen? Which challenges are they facing? Why is it so difficult for them? Or is it not difficult for them at all in terms of getting to market, getting to scale, and capturing the hearts and minds of the wider industry and the energy transition?
So, I think there's probably a few ways to answer that question. Starting a company in these spaces is often easier than growing that company. These are long cycle time technologies. They take a lot of development. A lot of development means a lot of money. And finding your way through that long valley of death before you get to commercial viability, particularly for a product like a carbon management product where the market is still evolving, is not simple. I see Brett Henkel in the audience. Brett actually used to work for me in a company I ran that was a hydrogen company, but Brett is one of the founders of Svante, which is a carbon capture company. You've been at it for 15 years?
More, but yeah. 20 years, right?
Yeah, and are at the cusp of commercialization. But they are one of the few that has had the good fortune to find the investment. I think your last raise was $260 million. So I think that's the biggest challenge, is to find a way to sustain yourself through that long cycle time period. It's not like an app where you can, design the app in a few months and all of a sudden you're able to generate revenues. And that means, and I know, there are people who think that the free market should decide everything. That means that governments actually do have a role to play. There have to be instruments to help with early stage R&D, to help companies actually get through that. In Canada, we do that through the tax system, through what's called our SHRED program that is refundable for companies before they are public, and that helps them in terms of funding their research and development. We also have organizations like Sustainable Development Technologies Canada that will partner on demonstrations and provide some of the capital to do it. And we have venture capital that's government funded to help to actually participate in providing equity capital. But that is a critical thing. And unless the government is willing to play a role in that, it's extremely difficult for long cycle technologies to get to the end.
Okay, so we have time for 2 questions, and I see 2 hands, which is awesome. So the gentleman in the white shirt, and then the lady after the gentleman. So those are the last 2 questions.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try and link all the things you said into one question. On benchmarking, my name is Henry Tillman. I deal with energy advisory, and I'm a specialist in thorium. So in the 72, when Nixon stopped it, CANDO kept it going. Yes, and you kept it going until the United States government released the patent to China in 2011. Yes, so now we have China, Russia, Indonesia all doing this, and we're talking about 20,000 gigs per machine around 2030. So in competition, where do you see yourself in that? And of course, you were in part of CANDO, so you were there 40 years ahead of time. Thank you.
So, sorry, you're talking about CANDO, the nuclear kit? Yes.
Thorium is part of it.
Yeah.
Thorium power. Thorium MSR.
So I'm not an expert on thorium, but I would say that with respect to more broadly nuclear technology, you're right, Canada has been a leader in that from a long time, and Canada was a significant contribution to growing the nuclear sector around the world. We have units in a whole range of different countries, and I think you know probably know we're building 2 new ones in Romania right now, and are looking at a refresh of the entire design to actually be a competitor with respect to large-scale nuclear going forward. There's also, as you know, huge amounts of work going on in a number of countries, including here in the United Kingdom, on small modular reactors. I had a long conversation with Minister Coutinho about that, I guess it was yesterday, in Paris. And that's an area that I think is ripe for both technology development, but actually for near-term commercialization. I think there is a very bright future for the nuclear industry. Not that nuclear is going to solve all of our problems. It is not a silver bullet, but it is an area where there are certainly geographies, including some of the provinces in Canada, where it's very difficult to see how you get to the grid of the future, which is a much bigger electricity grid, without some utilization of nuclear energy.
Hi, Amanda Van Dyke. I'm with Arch, a private equity fund. You mentioned something about decarbonization and the ocean and a Canadian technology or company that was working with respect to decarbonization of the ocean. And that link, I, one, like to know a little more about that, but two, I'm actually curious, given that the role sort of the ocean actually plays in decarbonizing the world and how that's threatened, and the fact that the oceans, or the vast majority of the oceans that cover 75% of the earth, are not really under the jurisdiction of any one country. Is there any, do you know of any efforts that are working specifically to address that?
Yeah, so there are a number of different thoughts about how you do carbon management, and the ones that are most familiar would be carbon capture and sequestration, or direct air capture. There's a lot of work going on mineralization, on using mine tailings to actually do carbon capture. The Oceans Network Canada work is really around, by and large, sequestering under the seabed, like what Norway does. Norway does that already. But certainly we can provide you some information if you're interested in that. I think you've got to look at novel ways to do it. I mean, just using the ocean is pretty full of CO2 already, and that's why we're seeing coral reefs dying and everything else. So you've got to be thinking about novel ways of actually utilizing the seabed, for example. In terms of international law or regulation with respect to the oceans, it is a challenge. And has been a continuing challenge for a number of decades because of the fact that it's not under the jurisdiction of any particular country once you get beyond the international boundary. The way that the international community has tried to address that is through treaties basically governed under the United Nations. And so there's work on how do you deal with the fishery that is outside of boundaries, which has been a big problem because you have huge commercial operations that are going around scooping up enormous amounts of fish, far more than is sustainable on a go-forward basis. There's a lot of work that's been done in the last couple of years around seabed mining, and whether we should be allowing seabed mining, whether it's close to your shore or internationally. I think the emerging view, and certainly Canada's view, is we should not be allowing seabed mining, at least right now, until we know more about what the impacts on the ecosystem would be. But it's really a case-by-case, issue-by-issue. Precisely, it's got to be done in an international forum of some kind if you're going to have countries abide by whatever it is that you're hoping everybody will abide by. So.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Minister, for your remarks. Perfect. So now we'll actually invite the minister back up on stage. So I know he came down, but he's going to be back up for an opportunity for a moderated conversation. So I'll invite Mike Crabtree from the Saskatchewan Research Council and Simon Main from Brookfield Asset Management to come up on stage. And we're running a little bit late, but hopefully we brought in a little bit of buffer time in the agenda. And if people are okay with having their coffees a couple, 5 or 10 minutes late, then I think we can kind of, push into the break a little bit. But yeah, this is an opportunity to talk with Mike and the Minister about the changing energy landscapes and give a Canadian perspective.
Okay, I hope this is on and you can hear me okay. I was not the original participant in this moderated panel. I'm not from the Financial Times, I'm afraid, so I've sort of stepped in at the last minute under request from the High Commission here. So apologies, and go easy with me if I'm getting it wrong. So I'll lean on my guests to be kind to me. I'm from Brookfield. We're a leading international investor, $900 billion of assets under management globally across a range of infrastructure areas, including the world's largest transition funds, dedicated transition funds, under which we've raised $25 billion so far for dedicated investment, and that includes areas such as carbon capture, hydrogen, industrial decarbonization projects, as well as traditional renewables, batteries, and everything like that. So coming at this with some wide range of interest. As you can tell from my accent, I'm British, but this is now the second time this week I've been in the High Commission, so I'm feeling like an honorary Canadian with every day that goes by working for Brookfield and being invited to this wonderful building. So anyway, that's a bit about me. We're obviously here with the Minister, Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, and with Mike Crabtree, the CEO and President of the Saskatchewan Research Council. So we're going to just cover some topics here, and I think the first thing to say is, and you mentioned it, Minister, you've come straight from Paris. We've had the IEA annual ministerial meeting, I think. It would be great to hear a little bit about what was going on this week. I think both of you were there, actually, so hearing some reflections about that meeting and what are the hot topics in that session.
So yeah, it was the annual meeting, but it was actually the 50th anniversary of the IEA, and so it was probably a bigger event than is normally the case. I'm sure most folks know who the IEA is, but the IEA is a grouping of, I think it's about 37 countries with a number of associate members, so I think it's about 43 or 44 in total. It was, interestingly enough, it was formed during the period of the oil embargo, and it was formed in order to essentially have largely consuming countries figure out how to respond to the oil embargo, and so the focus was really on alternative sources of supply, but also on energy efficiency. And the IEA has evolved over time into, I would say, the leading organization from a thought perspective in terms of the energy transition. So it does not just deal with oil and gas now, it deals with renewables and hydrogen and critical minerals and everything else. And certainly it is probably the go-to source of information for many folks in terms of where this is going. We met in the aftermath of COP to talk about how we think about this in the context of the energy transition and how we operationalize some of the commitments that were made at COP around the tripling of renewable energy and a range of other things. It is in part a group that is about having conversations that gets everybody on the same page such that we go home and we actually operationalize that individually. And it includes Japan, it includes the United States, it includes all of Western Europe, it includes South Korea. I mean, it is a huge organization, does not yet include India, although that is on the pathway, and it doesn't include China. But by and large, it is a very large and powerful grouping of countries. I think there is a huge amount and a deep consensus that we must figure out how to move more quickly, that we must be actually thoughtful in terms of how we are approaching the issues that I talked about in my speech. I think the big addition, if you read the communique this year, was for the first time ever we talked about the role of nuclear energy. That has been controversial within the IEA for some time. There are some countries that don't feel they need it, and some countries that have historically had some more negative views around the role of nuclear energy. I think everybody now understands that not for every country, but in aggregate, there must be a role for nuclear energy going forward, and that was affirmed in the communique. So I think it was largely about continued momentum around the energy transition. And again, I would just reaffirm one of the things that I said about the IEA is that in the most recent report that it put out, which was again affirmed by all of the governments around the table, the view is that this is ongoing, it is accelerating, and that particularly as it relates to fossil fuels, that gas, oil, and coal are going to peak in the very near term. And we are all going to be part of that transition that is going to end up with a future that looks quite different.
That's great. And Mike, do you want to share some reflections?
Yeah, I'd like to say first there's a clear dynamic between myself and the Minister here, because the Minister, I think, is Oxford Rhodes Scholar, was Cambridge, which we all know is vastly superior university. So I'd just like to get that straight from the
I just call it the other place. So.
The other place. I won't say what we called you. I was also at the IEA and as an observer there. And what struck me was that, on top of what the Minister said there, was a real genuine call to action, and a lot of I'd say guarded, realistic optimism about the route forward. And I think coming from a sort of technical engineering business investment background, what I found was really interesting was, and this was said several times, is that there are two main tracks for establishing the pathway to the energy transition. The first is to look at existing technologies that are out there, that we can innovate those technologies, improve them, and move them forward. And then secondly, there are the technologies that either have not yet been even thought of, but certainly not developed through to any commercial extent. And I think that the message I got, which was really, really important, was this, that we have to focus on both of those routes. I would argue slightly more to the former, because we've got to get this thing moving, and perfection is the enemy of us moving forward with the energy transition. And then certainly also look at the new technologies as well. And hopefully I'll get a little bit of a chance to talk about Saskatchewan and SRC's position in some of these areas.
That's great, and since you brought it up, I bet a tie break between the two of you. I was an Oxford man, so I'm going to, there we go, 2-1.
Can we have a show of hands?
Yes, indeed. Just before we sort of move on to some of the opportunities that are happening in Canada itself, just at the international level, while we're on that subject, the global security issue has risen right back to the fore. I think it's interesting to hear the history of the IEA that begins as an energy security body, and now that dynamic is right back in our face, with whether it's Russia, Ukraine, whether it's Yemen and the Red Sea, or whether it's the challenges in the Middle East more broadly. Just any reflections on the relative weighting in your conversations around, is decarbonisation slipping away and energy security coming up? Is there a recognition that these are reinforcing? How's that changing the dynamic on the international stage?
Yeah, it's interesting. You do hear some folks saying that, energy security is rising, and I think it is, in terms of its importance and its prominence, and that somehow actually is going to slow the energy transition. I would actually make the reverse argument, which is that the energy security concerns that exist today are actually accelerating the energy transition. So I chaired the gas task force for the IEA coming out of the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, when we were trying to figure out how to help Europe, and how Germany in particular, with its natural gas problem. And the IEA, again, was the leading thinker in terms of this, developed a 10-point plan as to how you could actually start to address this. Some of it, of course, was finding different sources of liquid natural gas. But a lot of it was around, how do you actually switch? How do you be more efficient? And in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Europe as a whole has reduced its gas consumption by about 15%. Mm-hmm. That's a big step forward, and it's a step forward towards more security. They also are increasingly looking at the transition as a way to enhance security, so that they're not dependent in the same way on sources of supply that are less democratic and less in terms of sharing common values, and being able to rely on themselves. Renewable energies are intensely local, right? You build the wind farms, the solar farms, the biomass facilities, the geothermal, the nuclear power plants. You don't need to import all of these things. You have far more security of supply. So I think it is the way in which most of the folks in the West are thinking about it is we are going to accelerate this in order to achieve energy security. The one caveat that I will put on that is we have to ensure that as we move through this transition, we don't end up in the same situation with another strategic commodity. And that, particularly in the energy transition context, is critical minerals. Right now, the bulk of supplies of many of the critical minerals are controlled by China, not just in China, but in Africa and other places. The processing technologies, and this is where the SRC comes in, are largely Chinese inventions and Chinese controlled. Even like the lithium processing plants in Australia are owned by China and the technology is Chinese. We have to get to a point where there is greater diversity of supply of critical minerals, and there are options in terms of processing technologies, particularly options that exist in the West, where there is greater reliability and you don't have to be in a position where another country that may not be fully aligned from a values perspective can exert influence. And so that one is something that is enormously important. Canada is working on that, but we are partnered with the United States, with the United Kingdom, with France, with Germany, on trying to figure out, and with Australia, trying to figure out how we actually drive that forward very quickly to ensure that that energy security issue is addressed.
Okay, that's really interesting, and maybe we could sort of continue on that thread, and maybe this is a moment to talk about what's going on in Saskatchewan, maybe, and maybe we can come to the wider economy in Canada. What's the contribution here that Canada can provide?
I'm going to segue question to question. I think that over the last 2 years we've had an energy shock for all of the reasons that we know, and I think it does have an immediate impact on the population. When you're shivering in your living room because you can't keep the heating on, your first thought is not to, we need to move to an energy transition because that's the way to. However, the corollary of that is as we come out of that, the realization is that supply chains and reliance has to change so that that doesn't happen again. And I think we're starting to get into that point. And I mentioned that magic phrase there, supply chains. And I think we're understanding, and everybody in this room understands, that we're moving from a hydrocarbon 20th century to a minerals energy century, and possibly beyond. The supply chain that we've used for our energy so far is 120 years old. It is the most advanced, it's the most efficient, it's the most globally integrated supply chain for the provision of oil and gas. It is operating now, it is inexpensive, it is efficient, and it delivers on what it says it's going to deliver. There's a lot of redundancy in there, even with the sort of shocks that we're seeing in the Middle East. We're transitioning away from a 120-year-old, very, very mature supply chain into a supply chain that we're making up as we go along here. What we need to do is to understand and learn from the oil and gas fully integrated supply chain, and that's what in Saskatchewan, SRC in its own way is looking to do. And the emphasis is not just on supply chains, it's on fully vertically integrated supply chains, so you can create that level of robustness and efficiency within the systems. And I'll hopefully get an opportunity to talk a little bit about that. In terms of global supply chains, what the Ukraine situation has taught us is that we need to look at regional supply chains, integrated regional supply chains. Canada is seen by the US, frankly, as being part of the North American supply chain piece as we move forward into energy transition. And Canada will play a significant role in that. I think Canada will also play a very significant role in the generation of the European, in inverted commas, regional supply chain. So integrated supply chains, the technology that is the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream pieces of that are what we at SRC are working on in a sort of industrial and commercialization mode.
It's great to hear, and I definitely want to have more detail, but before I do, I had one thought, which is a 120-year-old supply chain equals efficient, cheap, relevant. you're creating a new one, it might take another 120 years, but let's say we could do it half the time or a quarter of the time. How do we politically buy the time for those higher costs to flow into the system? Because even if you did it at lightning speed, in 10 years or 15 years, you're asking people to shoulder a cost. How do we broach that conversation? How do we manage that with our political audiences? I'm looking at you, Minister.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. I would say, first of all, I think the cycle times associated with technology development and supply chain development have actually accelerated since the dawn of the petrochemical age. But and I think, you know, it's instructive to think about wind and solar in that regard, right? Wind and solar 30 years ago was viewed as kind of early stage. It worked, way too expensive, never going to get there. How did it actually come down that curve? Well, Germany. I mean, Germany by and large, and a few other countries, but Germany put in place a rate structure that allowed it to actually come into the market, start to go down the technology cost reduction curve, come down the manufacturing cost reduction curve, and solar and wind are now the cheapest source of electricity that exists anywhere. And I think that's the model that we are going to see in many jurisdictions, or in many technology areas. We need to be able to accelerate that even faster. But I think in some of them, we're actually not talking about very nascent technologies that have to go all the way. We're talking about hydrogen-related technologies that have been around for decades. It's about optimizing them for performance, optimizing them for costs, and getting them to the point where they can actually be cost competitive. But I would also say that it is important in the context of moving through this that we are thoughtful about affordability. It can't just be that everything, the additional costs associated with some of the work that's going to have to get done in the early stages gets passed on to consumers. Because at the end of the day, you will run into a pushback from consumers who will say, wait a minute, I can't take this anymore. It's affecting too much my ability to pay my mortgage or buy my groceries. And so in the design of some of these things, we need to take that into account. And so you need to create programming that, particularly for people on lower and moderate incomes, that actually helps to buffer that. I would say that we've tried to do that with a number of tools. One is Canada prices carbon. We do. So does the European Union, so does the United Kingdom, so do most countries around the world. We price carbon to try to increase to ensure that people actually pay for pollution. Like, it's not a novel concept. You should pay if you're going to pollute. But at the end of the day, we've structured it in such a manner that 80% of the Canadian families actually get more money back than they pay in the price. And in fact, it works in reverse order to income. So the people who are better off, significantly better off as a result of the price on pollution, are the people who are most vulnerable. So you've got to think about policy instruments in that context to try to ensure that affordability is part of the policy design as you move through all of these things. I'm not saying it's simple. But at the end of the day, this isn't something that we're doing simply because we like solar and we like wind and we like biomass and we don't like oil and gas. Climate change is real. Climate change is happening. And we are running out of time. So we have to be very thoughtful about how we are doing this, and we have to do it quickly.
That's great. That's a very, very good answer to that question, so thank you. And I'm going to pick up now on something you said about the IEA meeting, which was the role for nuclear at the international level, and that coming back to the fore. There were announcements at COP as well. So there is a talk of a nuclear renaissance, and we have interests at Brookfield. We part own Westinghouse, and with Cameco, headquartered in Saskatchewan. So I wonder if we could just get some thoughts from you both about where that nuclear renaissance is going. How do the different technologies play a role, and where is Canada going to support in each bit of that? That's another vertically integrated supply chain that we've got to take control of potentially. So either one of you to go first, maybe.
Do you want me to start, or do you want to start?
I'll go, because I just thought of a witty response to that, which
Go for it.
SRC is introducing the first micro small modular reactor, a first of a kind in the world. And that is a Westinghouse eVinci reactor. So I'll be talking to you about a discount later on.
Not me, wrong person.
Yeah, I know that's not going to work. So I think that The Minister will talk about the broader nuclear piece there. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about micro small modular reactors. So these are reactors that operate in total power output less than 20 megawatts. So put that in context, the Avinci machine that we're looking at is 5 megawatts, about 15 megawatts total power. It's a heat engine, so it's an air-cooled reactor. It's transportable. It is ideal for applications in northern Saskatchewan in terms of its capabilities. Put that in context, the Avinci would supply power to about 3,000 homes. So it's about that sort of scale. It would be something that we could, it is a nuclear battery, essentially leaves the factory fully fueled, is deployed at site, provides power or heat, industrial heat or power for up to 10 years. Once the fuel is spent within the reactor, the whole reactor is taken back to the factory or another site for defueling and refueling. It is genuinely a nuclear battery. In terms of its application in Saskatchewan, two very interesting jurisdictions, parties that are interested in this. The first is the mining operations, northern mining operations, who, believe it or not, often power their mine sites with diesel. Diesel costs around about 70 cents per kilowatt hour. And has all of the carbon intensity implications on that. Saskatchewan is in a different position from the likes of Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia, in the sense that those provinces might be operating on 85 or even 90% renewables, nuclear and renewables. Saskatchewan is inverted. We have 85 to 90% still fossil. That is an existential challenge for the province, and one that is recognized. And it's an existential problem for the mining operations as well, because when they say great place to mine, so this is investors, folks in this room, great place to mine, great place to, great management teams, great resources, et cetera, et cetera. What's your route to net zero? Oh, and by the way, somebody told me that you use diesel to power your mine. So there is a real driver to move to that net zero piece. And micro small modular reactors are a real opportunity to do that, particularly when they're incorporated as base load within renewable microgrids, which is another area that we're looking at there. So what's the role of SRC? SRC does what the Saskatchewan Research Council always does, where research with a small r, development with a bigger D, and very big commercialization. That's what we do. We're about $300 million revenue, 450 engineers and scientists and technicians. You can tell it's SRC because if you spill matches on the floor, the chorus from the management team goes 126. So we're that kind of organization, but very heavily focused on commercialization. So nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, we'll be bringing in first of a kind, probably the first in the world, most likely by 2029. We're funded by Government of Saskatchewan to do that. Other areas that we work in, these very big projects, rare earths, we're building what will be the first vertically integrated rare earths processing plant, monazite to NdPr metals. That will be operational this year. Parts of the plant we're already producing commercial grade metals as of last week. Funded largely by federal government for that particular part. And then the other area that we're looking at is lithium processing, very much in the midstream. So we're looking at spodumene through to lithium hydroxide. Again, our role is to prove out the technology, prove out the financial viability so that investors, such as many of the folks in this room, can look forward 15 years and see a mature route to return on investment. That's our objective. And thirdly, to prove out markets. So that's very much the role of SRC within Saskatchewan and as a Canadian resource.
Let me just say one thing, two things. The first is actually one of the dangers of throwing away your speech is you actually forget I was supposed to make an announcement that we were giving you $5 million.
Well, you did that yesterday. This is an extra $5 million.
But the work that they are doing in rare earths is very interesting for the government of Canada, and I would tell you it's very interesting for the Americans as well. Some of the rare earths that they are looking to process actually have unique military applications, so the Americans are very interested in that. It's certainly an area that we want to see accelerate and proceed going forward. On your question, though, about nuclear, I mean, as you will know, as an owner of Westinghouse, there's kind of two categories. There's large-scale nuclear facilities, where the Westinghouse design, I think, is probably, outside of China and India, probably the most ubiquitous in terms of nuclear facilities. And the second one being the CANDU, which came out of the Government of Canada, and the intellectual property remains the property of the Government of Canada. There will be a role for large-scale nuclear, for sure. And there are a number of countries around the world that are looking at actually building. I mean, France has already announced they're building 6 new ones, and Ontario is going to be building a couple of new ones. But then there's this whole unique area of small modular reactors, which is what was being referred to. And there's a number of categories, you know, different applications in different sizes. Canada is actually deploying the first large-scale small modular reactor, a 300-megawatt reactor at the Darlington site in Ontario. It'll be running in 2028, and I think the rest of the Western world is looking at that particular thing. But then there are very small ones that are either community-based or are focused on industrial applications, like getting rid of natural gas to extract bitumen to reduce the carbon intensity of the oil from Alberta. There's a bunch of work going on in countries everywhere. And the one concern I have about it, I mean, the 300 megawatt doesn't compete with the 5 megawatt reactor, and the technology sets are different, but at some point there's going to have to be a shakeout of technology, because if you're going to, the point of the small modular reactor is modularity, right? You can build it, you can actually ship it largely to site, maybe in components, but it's to get that value of modularity, which is partly associated with manufacturing. And if everybody's making one, you're never going to get to the cost level that you need to. So somehow, over time, at least in sort of size sets, you're going to have some shakeout of the technology if you're ever going to achieve the cost levels that you need to achieve.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I'm being waved at a lot by these folks down in the front, so I'm going to leave it there and say thank you very much to you both, and we'll show our appreciation and have a coffee.
I feel that could have gone on for at least another 10, 15 minutes or even more. So I really want to thank the Minister, I want to thank Mike, and I really want to thank Simon for coming in. I know he mentioned it was last minute. It was actually a phone call at 10 p.m. last night that I was ringing him up. So again, very much thank you to everyone. We're running a little bit late. I know we have a scheduled break for, I think, I'm looking for 15 minutes. So if we can maybe make the break 10 minutes, then we can make up some time. So I welcome everyone back here. I'm looking at my phone. It's 2:40. So at 2:50, if you can come back here, it'd be great. Perfect. Thanks again.